Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. The First Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing political freedoms of speech, press, and assembly, is with us as much today as in 1791, when the founders ratified the Bill of Rights. The text of the First Amendment, a restraint on the state and national governments, is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Oliver Wendell Holmes interpreted the document to preserve freedom for the thought we hate. Justice Hugo Black saw the First Amendment in absolute terms. He thought that no law meant no law. But is free speech an absolute? Surely there are exceptions. Should hate speech be prohibited as it is in other Western countries? Canadian Supreme Court, in condemning hate speech, said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chamber, but with words. How should the First Amendment be applied on our university campuses as colleges provide platforms for speech and speakers that some see as racist, sexist, or inciting to violence? What does free speech contribute to the mission of the university? To what extent should speech be regulated on university campuses? With us to discuss these issues is Keith Whittington, a professor of politics at Princeton University. Keith has written a book on the subject entitled Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Princeton is distributing the book not only as a pre-read for entering freshmen, but also for the first time in its history as a statement of policy for the entire university community. We're pleased to welcome Keith Whittington to this table.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted. Now, let me ask you first, the First Amendment is a restraint on Congress. Are universities bound by the First Amendment?
Certainly some universities are not. So Princeton University doesn't have to worry too much about the First Amendment. Princeton has to worry about its own policies. State universities, on the other hand, do have to worry some about the First Amendment. They are constrained by American constitutional law. And part of what I find interesting about the book and this topic in general, thinking about free speech in the context of universities, is it does get us outside of constitutional law. It's not simply a consideration of, well, what are judges going to force us to do, but also forces us to ask a little bit, what would we want to do, given the kind of community we've constructed? Why should we value free speech for our own purposes, not just because the Constitution tells us we have to?
Does free speech mean something different in a university from what it means in Union Square, where someone gets up on a soapbox?
Well, I think there are different implications, at least, for thinking about free speech in a university context than there is in a public square. Universities, in part, have tried to construct a public square on campus as well. So they want to have those kind of free-ranging debates in public on important issues of public concern on a university campus, just like we would expect to see in a public park, for example. And universities have long been important for that. And in that sense, I think free speech is very similar, and the rules we would expect to be in place are very similar. On the other hand, universities are also trying to educate students. They're trying to foster scholarship. And there, I think the concept of academic freedom often captures what's at stake better than the concept of free speech itself, because academic freedom emphasizes the importance of expertise. So how do people who are qualified within their disciplines communicate what they know and advance human knowledge in the classroom and in their scholarship? And that's a little different than just anyone standing up in a public park and declaring their opinions. And universities want to make space for people to be able to declare their opinions, but they also want to make space for people to do real scholarship.
But there's a difference, isn't there, with regard to the audience? Because if I go to Union Square and I don't like what I'm hearing, I can walk away. I don't necessarily have to contradict the speaker. I can just go on my merry way. But students pay to attend Princeton University. They pay as much as $50,000 a year or more if they're not on scholarship. And why should they have to hear things that they disagree with?
Well, it's part of what you signed up for in going to college. I think it's a somewhat disturbing trend that for a lot of students do come in with that kind of consumerist mentality of thinking, look, I paid for this. I shouldn't be exposed to things that I find uncomfortable or that I disagree with, that might challenge my basic beliefs. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what you're trying to get out of a college education. We would hope that students are going to encounter things they disagree with, things they're going to find uncomfortable. But we'd also hope the university structures those encounters so they're productive, so that you're getting something of use out of that exchange. And so certainly in the classroom, you might be asked to read things that you're going to find uncomfortable and disturbing. You're going to hear arguments that you might find uncomfortable and disturbing. But the hope is that you will walk away with a more sophisticated understanding of those ideas than you might otherwise would. And certainly it's true faculty shouldn't use those captive audiences simply as a platform to express their political opinions disconnected from the subject matter of a class. On the other hand, if you're talking about what happens on a public square on a college campus, that's not so different than a public park as well. That if a speaker is standing up giving a talk about politics, for example, in the quad, students are free to walk away and do other things rather than listen to that, just like they would be in a public park. But you'd lose something if you shut that down and didn't have the possibility of people giving those kinds of speeches.
Now, you're closer to today's students, of course, than I am.
Further and further away every day.
But they've been called the iGen generation. Right. They were born after 1995.
Right.
And do you believe that they are more fragile than their predecessors, that they are more offended and vulnerable to ideas that they feel are intolerable?
I don't think they are necessarily. I think that the current students certainly have different sets of ideas that they're concerned about. So the things that they will find offensive are different than what their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents would have found offensive. But their great-grandparents certainly found things offensive as well, and often were intolerant to the things that they found particularly controversial or disturbing. And so I think in that sense, students are not that different. And I tend to think that the most productive way of trying to think about the free speech issue on college campuses is not to focus on the particular deficiencies of this generation of college students, but instead think about what they have in common with the college students that preceded them and indeed with American society more generally.
But the virtue of free speech is how it impacts the audience. I mean, there's no point in preaching unless you have some sinners out there. And the students, certainly in the last 5 years, have felt that the speech on campus, either coming from the professors or otherwise, was intrusive, and they've lobbied for 2 features of the university system. I don't know whether you have them at Princeton. One is called trigger warnings, and the other is called free space. Now, why don't you tell us about those?
Right, so we have not introduced either one of those on the Princeton campus, but they are certainly a subject of controversy on other college campuses. So trigger warnings, narrowly speaking, are warnings that you might provide to students before you introduce them particular content in a class, for example. So you might include on your syllabus some warning that a particular set of materials are going to be exposed to some students might find particularly disturbing. So we might think of them as like content warnings that you might see on broadcast television. For example.
This pill can kill you.
This pill can kill you. Or, you know, the following footage might be disturbing to some viewers, kind of thing.
So should Harvard Law School, teaching a criminal law course, have a trigger warning? They're going to go into the law of rape and the law of incest and the law of sodomy, and so that people who are offended don't have to attend the course. Maybe they're flunked out for non-participation.
Right, so I think there are 2 issues here. One is, what should you tell students up front about what it is they're about to encounter? And then what should you do about the fact that students sometimes find what they're about to encounter disturbing? So I think certainly faculty in general ought to make students aware of what the content of the course is going to look like, what kinds of materials they want to cover. I think my concern on that front is that we ought to leave it to the discretion of faculty about how to do that. So I worry a lot about college administrators coming in, for example, with a very heavy hand and telling faculty, well, if you're going to assign a given a book, for example, you have to attach a trigger warning to it, in which case faculty might not assign the book, students might not read the book if it has that kind of label on it. I would much rather trust the faculty to help introduce that material to students and trust that they will introduce it in a way that's useful and sensitive to what students are getting. The other question is, what should students do, or what should be the expectations when students are encountering material they find particularly difficult or uncomfortable? So these kinds of examples, like in a law school criminal justice class or criminal law class, and you're encountering material on sexual assaults, should students be excused from having to read that material, have to take exams on that material and the like? And I think in most contexts, that's going to be very difficult to do. You want to prepare students for grappling with that material, but you can't excuse them from grappling with that material. There's certainly instances in which it may make sense for students to say, well, look, there's a certain kind of class I just don't want to take because I'm going to be too uncomfortable with the subject matter. But sometimes those choices aren't available to you. So if you want to become a lawyer, you ought to be exposed to criminal law. And if you're going to be exposed to criminal law, you have to be exposed to sexual assault issues as well as other kinds of issues that might be quite disturbing to a given individual student. And that's part of what you've signed up for.
Yeah. Now, how about safe spaces? What is a safe space?
So I think this is also a term where there's it's used very amorphously, and I think people disagree about what exactly they're talking about in trying to use the term. In general, the idea of a safe space is the idea that either a physical space or a metaphorical space in which students are not going to have their feelings assaulted, their beliefs assaulted. They aren't going to have their opinions questioned very much. So it comes out of a kind of therapeutic context in which we want to validate everybody's opinions and not criticize people's opinions as such. This has been leveraged as a way of trying to talk about whether or not you should have controversial speakers on campus, for example, where there's an argument that a campus ought to be a safe space and students shouldn't be exposed to a set of ideas or a kind of rhetoric that they find particularly difficult or threatening in some fashion. And I think universities have to push back against that, at least in that kind of broad sense. They have to understand that universities as such have to be a safe space for having difficult discussions, for being a place where you can talk about controversial ideas, and that people are sometimes going to be disturbed by that. And we shouldn't try to exclude that from campus. On the other hand, there may be reasons to carve out particular kinds of spaces on campus where students can join together in fellowship with other students who share their ideas and beliefs, so that we shouldn't think students are constantly having to argue with one another 24/7. There's certainly opportunities to do other things on campus, but we also have to recognize campuses are places where people argue, and that's important to maintain as well.
Well, they can talk over the odious ideas their professors have given them in the classes that, where there have been no trigger warnings. But is the idea something like post-traumatic stress syndrome, that they're worried about how their psyche may be damaged by certain ideas that they get from the classroom?
So certainly the origins are in a concept like that, although it's used much more loosely than that in practice. But there is a more general argument that students are going to be, and others on campus, are going to be harmed by particular kinds of speech that they find particularly threatening, that are disturbing, that question core beliefs of theirs, question aspects of their political identity, question whether or not those students, for example, should have been admitted to campus in the first place. And from their perspective, then, those kinds of ideas are psychologically and emotionally harmful. They damage their educational experience, make it harder for them to engage in education on campus. And as a consequence, those kinds of arguments ought to be excluded from campus so they aren't exposed to them.
So who is worrying about the issue? The vulnerable? Those suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, so that if you utter some conservative idea in your politics class, they're going to go into a catatonic coma, or are there other people who profess to be advocates for the vulnerable?
It's mostly advocates, and so I think
do they know what they're talking about? I mean, is it sense or is it nonsense?
I think there's a kernel of sense, and then a lot of nonsense. But there is an important kernel there, that there are people who have been genuinely traumatized, and they in fact may well have a hard time with certain kinds of materials and the like, and have legitimate medical issues that ought to be taken into account. And universities ought to do what they can to accommodate people in those kinds of situations. As it's used much more loosely, it becomes sort of more and more problematic for how campus has to operate. And so I think we should take seriously and recognize the fact that there is certain kinds of arguments and rhetoric that some students will take as emotionally difficult, and that they will find threatening, and that they will find painful. Then the question is, what do you do about that? And I think, and what kind of speech sort of satisfies that situation? And so I think what we ought to be focused on campuses is not the idea that you will never find something or encounter something that you find emotionally difficult or upsetting, but instead we should focus on if you're going to encounter that kind of speech, is it productive? Is it intellectually useful? Are we learning something from that speech, despite the fact that it's sometimes hard to grapple with?
Are you familiar with the concept of speech codes?
Yeah.
Now, at least a third of our universities in the United States have speech codes. Are there any at Princeton?
No, not technically. So there's certainly
But
some.
what about substantively? Are there speech codes?
Well, so part of the problem with speech codes is it's a somewhat vague concept as well. So some universities, fewer now than once was the case, have adopted something that were very specifically oriented toward regulating student language on campus and arguments on campus. And so they would say there are certain kinds of speech you can't engage in, certain kinds of words you can't say, and the like. And so we're directly concerned with regulating speech. But that blurs into a much broader set of rules that all campuses are going to have about how students should conduct themselves on campus. So you shouldn't harass other individuals on campus. You shouldn't fight with other individuals on campus, as well as various other kinds of rules affecting student conduct. And some of those student conduct rules have some implications for things that people might think of as speech as well, even if you don't have something laid out specifically as a speech code as such.
So that might be where speech morphs into verbal conduct, harassment.
No, that's exactly right. And a lot of, I think, there certainly are a lot of disputes in the current environment that are on that border between harassment and speech more.
What defines the border? Where does free speech end and where does harassment begin?
So I think we ought to hew as closely as possible the sort of legal definitions of harassment in general. So the law has, and the courts have struggled with trying to figure out what harassment means in a workplace environment, for example, and have struggled to try to define those boundaries in ways that are not too invasive on how people engage in speech in other kinds of contexts.
But is harassment in the eyes of the beholder, or is it in the eyes of the people who are trying to teach a class in college?
So I think it can't be in the eyes of the beholder, right? And so people can be overly sensitive, people can take offense to things where offense isn't meant, but also where reasonable people would say no offense should have been taken, and that can become much more restrictive. And moreover, I think the expectations about what student conduct ought to look like are going to differ depending on the setting, even on a college campus. And so that's one thing that makes colleges complicated relative to workplaces, for example, that I expect students behave very differently in a classroom than how they would behave in their dormitory, for example. And they can have discussions in a dormitory that are more free-ranging, more passionate, and perhaps meaner and rougher in that kind of context than what you would expect to take place in a classroom setting.
Might drive a student to a safe place where he doesn't have to hear ideas he disagrees with, he or she.
Well, and of course, and one reason why you want somewhat different expectations about what happens in a classroom than what happens in a dorm is it's possible to retreat. If you're having those kind of conversations in the cafeteria, it's possible to get up and move move away from those people and get out of that conversation. If you're having those kind of conversations in a classroom, it's much more difficult for a student to step out of that. And so as a consequence, we need to make some efforts to make sure that emotions don't get out of hand, even when you're talking about things people care about passionately in the classroom.
Is an aspect of the problem the procedure for admitting students to the university? I mean, should they be screened and filtered for sensitivity? Should everyone applying to Princeton be required to read your book? And
well, that's certainly true.
And then sign a paper that they agree with it?
Well, that part's not true. So I don't think we need to change how we deal with admissions. We want universities to be as open as possible to bring in a wide range of people. And we should recognize that if we're opening up universities, bringing in a very wide range of people, that they're going to come in with lots of different perspectives, but also lots of different background assumptions and their abilities to do these things. I think what's critically important, though, is universities ought to be upfront and straightforward with students about what the expectations are on campus. What should they be expecting to encounter when they get to college? And I think universities don't always do a good job of that. That we emphasize how much fun you're going to have at college. We emphasize how it's in your economic interest to go to college. But we don't necessarily emphasize to them, you're going to find things on campus that are disturbing, things that are offensive, things that are difficult for you. And that's part of the point. That's why universities are beneficial for you in the long run, because you're going to encounter those things. And so I think we can do a better job of orienting students as we're bringing them in about what we expect them to be doing while they're on a college campus and how they ought to adjust their expectations.
We expect them to be open to the thought they hate.
That's right. We should expect them to be open to new ideas and difficult ideas. And in many cases, they ought to be trying to seek out those difficult ideas precisely because they can learn from them. Again, that doesn't mean students need to be arguing with each other 24/7. There are plenty of other things to be doing on college campuses as well. It also doesn't mean that every set of disagreements and arguments is actually a productive and enlightening one. Sometimes they aren't, in which case it's useful to step out of that and try to find people to engage with, books to engage with, ideas to engage with that are actually going to be helpful and will improve your understanding of things rather than be unhelpful.
And that's true in the natural sciences as well as the social sciences.
Sure, no, that's right. I mean, part of what universities are trying to do, certainly in the classroom and in scholarship, is weed out bad information. And so you would not expect to see somebody in a biology class spending lots of time talking about Bigfoot, for example. And so students might have an interest in Bigfoot. There may be occasions where you can talk about that elsewhere on college campuses. But you expect the scientists on campus to be making decisions about what kind of information is valuable information, what kinds of issues are on the table and worth debating, and we need new evidence for, and we need to think about those ideas carefully because there's important disagreements about them, and which kind of ideas just aren't worth our time and are worth setting aside and not talking about very much.
Now, is free speech on campus a left-right issue? Historically, the proponents of free speech have come from the left. And
That's right.
Now it would appear that the people who are trying to restrict speech are on the left. Is this a sea change from the development of constitutional laws we've known it?
Certainly, it's a big flip. I think it's probably temporary. I think we'll see students and faculty on the left decide that free speech is valuable in the future as well when new kinds of controversies arise. But certainly, it's been the case for the last few years that the debate on campuses themselves is such that it's often those on the political left who are arguing that we ought to be more restrictive of speech, and it's those on the political right that are arguing we ought to be more open to speech. On the other hand, the other thing that this connects to is sort of who has power on college campuses. And so if you are confident that college administrators, college faculty, for example, are likely to agree with you if they're empowered to suppress speech, then you can be much more comfortable giving them that power because you think they're going to suppress other people's speech, not your own speech. And so to the extent that you think campus administrators are on the left, if you think faculty are on the left, then if you're a left-wing student, you may think there are few downsides to empowering those faculty and those administrators to shutting down speech. On the other hand, if you think that state legislatures, alumni, trustees are going to get involved, they often are much more conservative and they're likely to restrict a whole different set of speech. And so I think the pressures from outside university campuses to restrict speech often do come from the political right. The pressures for suppressing speech inside of college campuses often comes from the political left.
May I ask about your politics?
Sure.
You consider yourself to be a liberal or a conservative?
So I'm conventionally thought of as being on the political right. I think of myself as a libertarian, a classical liberal, and so I don't fully agree with lots of things that conservatives would tend to agree with in general, and I share lots of things that I agree with folks on the left, but certainly there's lots of things I disagree with folks on the left as well.
So how'd you get interested in the free speech issue?
Well, broadly, I'm interested in constitutional law, and so have a background of that and teaching that in general. A lot of what I teach about are more structural issues, federalism, presidential power, have a weird and I thought irrelevant expertise in presidential impeachments, for example. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about those kinds of issues.
May not be so irrelevant.
May not be so irrelevant these days. But free speech is among the things I teach about and I read a lot about, and increasingly it became obvious that I thought there were things that needed to be said and argued about on campuses that weren't being talked about enough and in quite the right ways, and it seemed worth wading into these debates.
So, are you familiar with the Chicago Statement on Free Speech? I think it was issued in 2015. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so Chicago formed a committee a few years ago to look at what the core commitments of a university are regarding free speech in general, and wound up writing a statement that is fairly brief, but quite bold in its claims on behalf of free speech. So it defends a very robust conception of free speech that it argued is consistent with University of Chicago's traditional values, but it also lines up with statements that we saw emerging out of the 60s and 70s, for example, on other campuses. Yale University had a famous statement that was much longer but somewhat similar in its logic. I'm happy to say that the Princeton faculty were the second campus in the country to adopt the Chicago Statement as its own as well.
How many universities have adopted it?
I don't know how many have done it at this point. There's quite a few, and there are more that are considering it.
But the majority have not, isn't it?
The majority have not.
Vast majority.
Of course, there's a tremendous number of colleges out there, and so I think some haven't yet adopted it in part because they don't see any need to on their particular campuses, or in general. Some haven't adopted it because they have disagreements with those statements. I thought at Princeton it was important for us to adopt it, not because we had particular problems at Princeton that we needed to combat. We sometimes have problems. I think actually Princeton's extremely good on this front. But I think it was important in our current national environment to join a national statement about the importance of free speech on campus and communicate that not only to people in the Princeton community, but also communicate that more nationally.
Is freedom of speech in jeopardy on our college campuses today?
I think freedom of speech is always in jeopardy, and both on college campuses and American society more generally. It's easy to think that you value free speech. It's very hard to stick to that when you're confronted with speech you disagree with.
Hard to stick with that when you're confronted with speech you disagree with. Thank you so much for coming by.
My pleasure.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.